You can applaud again afterwards. This meeting was actually prepared with the concept that there are two parallel issues. One is clinical cross-cultural competence, and the other is research cross-cultural competence. And in some ways, we may have drifted a little bit into an emphasis on the research, which is why I think that this workshop was so very important, and this discussion also, which involves everyone else. One of the main issues I think that all of us face in terms of cross-cultural clinical practice, and I'm not sure whether it was handled in the workshop, is the issue of translation. I don't know if you did that there in any way, but I think that's critical, and it's one of the things that we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to, because not every clinic that we work in has professional translational services or whatever. And I can give you a quick anecdote that I ran into that always highlights this for me, where I had an Ethiopian patient who came in for abdominal pain, and I think it was his brother-in-law who was translating, and that's a separate issue altogether, who should translate. And I asked for some kind of description of the pain, at which the Ethiopian patient went into a 5-minute talking in his hands and pointing, and it was amazing. For 5 full minutes, he gave this amazing description of whatever, because I had no idea. And I asked the translator, what did he say? And he says, oh, he said it hurts. So this issue is really something that I don't think we maybe pay enough attention to, but it really is quite critical in our work.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Ami will be presenting the research symposium, the research workshop.
Okay, well, since almost everybody came to our workshop and not the other one, I don't really know. What I tried to do was put together, do we have it? A sort of a compilation of highlight slides from each of the lectures that were given. What we tried to do in the workshop was look at why cross-cultural research has potential to make contributions to our field, look at the types of studies that have been done, some of which highlight particularly good methodology, of the type that we would like to expand on in the future, and look at some of the issues of methodological problems that we're going to have to overcome in order to move forward in this area. So we just opened up with, and I won't go into this in detail again, what I would consider to be the potential spectrum of benefits and contributions from multinational cross-cultural research, and it expands the entire gamut of all the research interests that we have. So I think that to put it into 1 or 2 words, multinational cross-cultural research does not mean prevalent studies. It does mean, but it does not only mean that. It can include areas such as symptom attributions, psychosocial aspects, and then going into even pathophysiological gender relationships, genetics, pharmacogenomics. All of the areas that we actually do any of our research can be, at least in my mind, improved and benefit from multinational studies. So our first speaker was Professor Hungan from the UK. He actually presented 3 fascinating studies with different approaches and different methodology. I don't have time now to show them all, but the 3 were a quantitative study, which was the 8-country European study, which many of us are familiar with. Wonderful methodology. I always use it as an example of where I think we should be going. The second was a study of focus groups and interviews in the UK and Netherlands. And the third, which I will mention a little bit, was a qualitative anthropological study in the UK and Sri Lanka. Now, the first study that they did was the 8-country European study, where they actually organized about 5,000 subjects in each country. So they had 40,000 subjects in this study, a little bit over, using the same methodology, the same pre-planning and design in all of the countries together. The questionnaire was prepared so that it was culturally relevant in all of the countries. And one of the things that was emphasized was the use of a random digital dialing system, with the emphasis not on we need to send out 1,000 questionnaires, let's say, and if we get 200 back, then that's our response rate, but keeping on working on that until we get the 1,000 that we need, which is how they reached the 40,000 people. The sampling was done basically in the same way by a market research methodology, and I think that was his second point, that there are people in this world that know how to do things better than we do, and we should use their help in order to accomplish things and not just assume that we know how to do it, even though there are other people that do it better. So the lessons learned here were that conventional methodologies may not be suitable for large-scale data collection. We should learn from market research, and that still there are limitations in international comparisons if they're done only by questionnaire and in this type of research setting. The third one was a qualitative study. I think that we really liked, all of us. It was a study of a strange tribe called doctors. And it was done by actually being brave enough to move around in and live alongside these doctors. And they did one-on-one interviews, group and optimistic conversations, basically getting inside data on perceptions and attitudes towards how they related to functional problems in their patients. It was compared with UK colleagues and included, as you can see here, GPs, gynecologists, and psychiatrists. In Sri Lanka and probably all South Asian countries, the interplay of culture and beliefs has a very strong influence on health problems. That was one of the conclusions of this study. While these factors also play a role in Western settings, sorry, I'm hitting the wrong button all the time, clinicians are not trained to handle them. And interestingly, although doctors may not think that their patients should function or act or be treated in a way which reflects their cultural and maybe non-medical setting, thank you. Doctors actually do that when they're taking care of themselves or their own. So there's sort of a disconnect between what doctors think their patients should or shouldn't do and what they actually do themselves. So these are examples of quantitative and qualitative research in a cross-cultural setting, which I think gave us a lot of insight and information. His conclusions were that cross-cultural studies have potential to deepen our understanding of health problems. Lessons from other countries still apply to our own settings. Quantitative studies alone are not enough. And functional problems, especially IBS, are a worldwide challenge, and there's no one-size-fits-all management. Then Dr. Mary Joan Gerson presented information on 2 studies, one of which has been completed and one of which is in the implementation stage. Her emphasis was not on the results of the studies, but on the methodology so that we could learn a little bit from their experience in doing this. And she talked about recruiting, how to recruit collaborators and establish this multinational collaboration. Their style was to do it actually mostly through personal relationships and contact, although they did look for people in the literature who were also involved and might be recruited to do it. To set clear goals, information about the questionnaires as they should be developed. They must reflect local beliefs, things that we've been talking about throughout this meeting. And have collaborators involved before the study begins, meaning not only plan your study and then recruit other people to do it with you, but have them involved in the planning stage from the beginning. The first study was an 8-country study of family relationships, mind-body attributions, and symptoms in IBS, and I think this is particularly interesting because it went beyond either prevalence or specific symptoms, although it covered both of those, and went into actual patient attributions to the symptoms, the kind of explanatory model that we've been discussing throughout this meeting, and that was looked into in this study. These are the people that participated. Some of them are here. Some of the, we won't look at the results now, but some of the questions, at least specifically one questionnaire was designed for this study by the Gersons. Of course, as you know, Dr. Gerson is married to Dr. Gerson, and they're both sitting in the back there. The second study is a 9-country study of attachment style, which I won't try to explain. negative pain beliefs and catastrophizing in IBS. Now, once again, this is beyond rates and symptoms and into the core questions of what types of psychological and other factors affect symptoms and whether they're different in different countries and in different cultures. I think it's going to be a fascinating study. It's being done in 10 countries. It was supposed to be done in 9, sorry. It was supposed to be done in 10, and I dropped out, so I apologize. And there'll be 50 patients and 20 controls at each site. And I'm not quite sure how far in they into the implementation, but I know that we're definitely very interested in seeing the results. Halfway through. Okay. That sounds good. And the conclusions were that in future studies, the type of variables that have to be addressed are cultural beliefs in relation to illness and pain, gender effects, family traditions and relationships patterns, socioeconomic differences, rural versus urban, socio-political environment, particularly change and upheaval, Western versus traditional healthcare, and dietary differences. So out of this comes a whole slew of ideas of the directions that we can go in doing cross-cultural studies. Next, we heard from Dr. Zuckerman on a study which was done quite a long time ago, in 1988, I believe, if I remember correctly, together with Doug Drossman and others, which I still think was one of the pioneering studies in a kind of cross-cultural approach, which is why we invited him to present it, even though it was done so long ago. And in this study, they did a comparison of both bowel patterns and healthcare utilization between Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites in El Paso. Survey of a bi-ethnic non-patient population. They found that the prevalence of IBS was less in Hispanics, although the difference between the groups was no longer statistically significant after they controlled for covariates, which are listed here. But there were ethnic differences in dietary factors, particularly intake of coffee, beans, chili, and in laxative use. And in terms of health care behavior and consultation, the Hispanics were less likely to seek health care for IBS symptoms or other bowel complaints. They were more likely to self-medicate with folk remedies to maintain bowel function or to treat their complaints. And they had a poorer perception of their health in general and more concern about their health and bowel function. So this was, I think, an early important study which compared two cultural groups in the same geographic area on parameters that are quite interesting and important to us. The next step was to go a little bit more deeply into the problem. One of the major methodological problems which we have, which has been alluded to here, is how to translate in a way that we can be pretty sure that we're okay in terms of what we're trying to do, which I presented. Just very briefly, the challenge, of course, is to adapt a study instrument so that it retains the meaning and intent of the original instrument, but it's culturally relevant and comprehensible. Of course, that's much easier to say than to do, and there's a whole literature on how to do this, and we have been making recommendations about how to do it, including 2 papers that I published on this subject. What we're looking for is a cultural rather than a literal translation. And I think the important thing now is not how to do it, but be aware that this is a critical issue in cross-cultural studies, and anyone who's going to embark on one of those studies has to think about how to do this in advance. In that respect, the Rome Foundation has set up a translation project to translate in a approved manner with monitoring by the Rome Foundation of all of its material, primarily the questionnaires, but also the book and the clinical algorithms, into as many languages as possible to make them available for research. The Rome Foundation stamp of approval will mean that it has been done in a way that follows guidelines that we consider sufficient, and nobody will be able to publish a paper saying that they used the Rome-approved Spanish version of the Rome 3 questionnaire unless they actually use the Rome-approved Spanish version, which is the one that we approved. And that's the guidelines to how it would be done. After that, we heard Donald Patrick, who gave a fascinating talk based on things that they've learned from the IBS QOL questionnaire, which was developed as opposed to the usual way of doing things in several languages simultaneously, which is a wonderful way to prepare questionnaires because it solves the cultural problems. It was done very, very well. It's very resource intensive and quite expensive and problematic, so it can't be adopted by everybody, although it's certainly recommended a method. And they learned through that many, many obstacles and problems and barriers that arise. So the objective was to review the linguistic and cultural differences in the expression of GI symptoms and impacts, because he looked at both symptoms and impacts. They're two different scales. Linguistic differences, meaning you can't find the literal equivalent, and cultural differences, meaning you can't find an equivalent concept. And it turns out, just like we mentioned about bloating, for example, earlier, that there are certain concepts and ideas and symptoms that, at least in some languages, just cannot be translated. And what you have to do is learn how to do a workaround so that you may paraphrase it or you may explain it in a number of words or any other way to try to get the idea across. We heard from Jan the other day about pictograms. I thought that was a fascinating idea, but it's not something that was included here. And what they had was the IBS QOL, which was developed in conjunction, of course, with Doug Drussman. 24 languages, which were comprised 4 linguistic families, 9 languages for the symptoms, 2 linguistic families, and this is the impressive map that they had. And that they found that there are some items that are particularly difficult to translate, and they really had to work on those a lot. The items raising the most difficulty, for example, I have to avoid strenuous activity. I feel unclean. I feel unclean was one of the examples that he went to in detail for various countries, and so on and so forth. There were the example that I just gave. I feel unclean because of my bowel problems, and the solutions that were found in various languages, and those are just some of the languages in which they had to really sit down and think about how to solve these problems. And the recommendations were to prepare a concept sheet with the concept being measured, what the intention of the item is, and patient quotes, and actually go into a serious cognitive focus group kind of thing in order to work this out. To have item writing guidelines, use an assessment of translatability, and other things, which, once again, are details of methodology. I think what's important here is to be aware that if we don't make ourselves aware and conscious of these kind of things, then we're going to get into trouble somewhere down the line in our research. So in summary, and these are my own words, well-designed multinational cross-cultural studies are feasible. They contribute significantly to our understanding of various aspects of IBS, not just prevalence. And we are now setting up, as some of you may know, a Rome Foundation working team on cross-cultural research, hopefully to prepare recommendations to advance this area of multinational, multicultural study, and to actually launch several, what I would call visionary global research studies. So thank you.